إنما هو التوحيد وتوحيد العبادة بالذات.
I mean, I have two images here just to highlight it. Right? There's this one image from 1884 original Pear soap advertisement. Right? A little black boy goes into the bathtub, washes himself with Pear soap, and he comes out white. I mean, this is a blatant, I mean, you can't get more blatant than that. Right? Yeah, there was a big controversy just very recently, right? And the other picture I have here, this sale of skin lighteners. I mean, throughout the world, from Africa to India, all over the world, they're selling skin lighteners. That somehow simply having lighter colored skin makes you better, more beautiful, more intelligent, whatever. So this racism, this scientific racism that was put in place, and again, it's a product that it comes out of the West, it's marketed by the West, it's imposed throughout the world, by the West, over 200 years. So this seeps into people's thinking. This seeps into people's self-perception. That everything is, and again, as I mentioned earlier, you look at Hollywood movies, right? And what was the big controversy just very recently at the Academy Awards, right? It's all white controlled. It's all the awards go to whites. There's still arguments and debates, and this is Hollywood. I mean, I don't want to get into I mean, Hollywood is bad enough as it is, and but even within that system, even within that Hollywood culture, it's dominated by racist attitudes. Right? And just by contrast, I give the verse from the Quran. Most of us, I think, would be familiar with this, from Surah number 49. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuha, a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Ya ayyuhan nasu inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha wa ja'alnakum shu'uban wa qaba'ila li'ta'arafu inna akramakum indallahi atqakum inna Allaha alimun khabir. O mankind, indeed we have created you from male and female and made you peoples and tribes that you may know one another. Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous of you. Indeed, Allah is knowing and acquainted. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that all of these differences, skin, culture, ethnic group, racial group, whatever, none of this is important. The piety in the heart is what is important. So this is completely opposite. What the Western culture has built up for 200, 300 years is in direct opposition to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. Because everything is based on the most superficial aspects of race and ethnicity. Okay? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us these things. Right? And the sad thing is so many Muslims for so long ignore what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says and follow what the Western narrative throws out at us. Just very quickly then to move to another aspect of what developed in the West, similar to race or connected to scientific racism, is the idea of social Darwinism. Many of us probably have heard of this already more than scientific racism. Right? It's a very common term, social Darwinism. It uses ideas drawn from Darwin's evolutionary thesis, such as natural selection and survival of the fittest. Right? These concepts are applied to the human race to explain why Western civilization emerged dominant in military, political, economic, intellectual, and social spheres. Right? So basically, the social Darwinists use those ideas to say, well, here's the differences. Why did the West colonize? Why did the West militarily defeat all these people? It's because they are these inferior people. Right? That this struggle for survival amongst the human race has led to the victory of white Western Christian culture and the defeat of everybody else. Right? So in the struggle for dominance, white Western culture won out against all other races and cultures, which now must submit and serve the master race. Right? And these ideas were propagated by many people, but three names that stand out from the 19th century are Herbert Spencer, William Graham Sumner, and Francis Galton. So if you want, you could look up these people. Right? Now, the idea of scientific racism and social Darwinism is also closely related to the euphemistic concept of religious humanitarianism. This became very popular in the 19th, 20th century. It was the premise of the whole missionary activity, because Christian missionaries from Europe and America went out to the rest of the world to spread not only Christianity but Western culture. Okay, and this was sort of summarized in the term "white man's burden." Perhaps you've heard of this as a famous poem by Rudyard Kipling, "The White Man's Burden." And basically, it meant that it was the burden, the duty, through evolution that the white European race came out on top, and it was now their obligation to bring their culture to everybody else. So Christianity and civilization were to be brought to these people. So all the inferior races and cultures of the world had no civilization. And so it was up to the Europeans to bring civilization, which meant bringing all of the Western model to the rest of the world. And no one is of any value unless and until they completely adopt the Western model of culture and government and economics and everything else. But as I said, there's an inherent paradox, because the West is never going to let anyone actually reach parity, and all their policies are meant to keep defeated peoples in an inferior status. So
this is that we have. Sorry to go back a little, right? As far as industrialization, right? And you have countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, who have a problem with electricity. They only have like 4 to 6 hours of electricity on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
And that's killed the country economically. I mean, are these sort of policies in effect that cause the decline or the non-existence of industrialization in these countries?
Well, that would be part of it, yeah. Because going back to those policies of the IMF and the World Bank, they're designed to make sure nobody actually industrializes. Now, of course, just to backtrack a little bit, in that quote that I mentioned earlier, he said a dual economy. So what you see in many of these countries is that there is a certain elite group of people within the country, a westernized group. And we see this throughout, just looking at the Islamic world, from the 19th century, early 20th century, going from modern-day Turkey, the Arab world, and Iran and Persia, the subcontinent. You get a group of people who attach themselves to the Western conquerors, and we see the sort of divide and conquer policies throughout the colonized world. Many of the problems in sub-Saharan Africa, even in the Middle East today, are products of the way the West has created systems. Taking a small indigenous group, a local group of people, elevating them, giving them some privilege and power, to do the bidding of the Western countries. And this is why he said they're dual economies. So you could go to Pakistan, you could go to India, you could go to different places, and there will be a very wealthy elite group of people. Recent reports I've read about India is highlighting this, and people in India themselves are pointing this out. That you have a highly sophisticated group of people, very wealthy group of people in India. Right? However, the vast majority of people are still, living in miserable poverty. Right? You see the same thing in China. Although the history of China and its development under Marxism and communism is a little bit different, but you still see this, the effects of globalization, the global economy, where you have a few people, a small percentage of the population, very wealthy, tied into the global economy, but the vast majority of the people are suffering. Right? And this is a major thing. We see it happening here in the United States. And we start talking about the 1% and the 99%, the loss of the middle class. Right? This is all part of this globalization, where you have a few people who are very wealthy, very tied into the system, and the vast majority of the people are going to be suffering. Right? And this is sort of the picture across the board. Okay. So anyway, the assumption that only white Christian Europe was civilized and all the other cultures had to somehow adopt and conform to that white Christian culture. However, I point out the scientific racism and social Darwinism by the early 14th, 20th century showed their true reality in Europe, which had descended into the grips of fascist ideologies, particularly Nazism, right? So fascism, Nazism, and this is a direct byproduct. I mean, ultimately, the scientific racism and the social Darwinism creates a culture that's going to destroy itself, right? Because these ideas got tied into nationalism, right? The rise of nationalism in the 19th century, okay? The reality of the nation state. And so it only became, almost obvious that you would end up, within Europe itself, deteriorating into all the conflicts that emerged from World War I through World War II. Right, so pride of race and nation became the overriding theme of the day and contributed significantly to the rise of the totalitarian state. Right? And I mean, this is what Europeans did to themselves. And this is how scientific racism and social Darwinism and nationalism and patriotism all impacted Europe itself. Everybody tends to almost overlook this. Okay, but this is what happens. So from the Islamic year 1332, 1914, until the Islamic year 1364, 1945. I mean, what happened in Europe? World War I. The Depression, the rise of fascist states, right? The rise of Stalinism in Russia, all the way through World War II. How many millions and millions of people? Right? And this is what the Europeans did to themselves. Right? So how can we expect them to do anything better with the rest of the world? Right? Okay. Finally, the two ideologies also drove the policies of Stalin and other form of totalitarianism, right? That meaning the communist state. And we see the policies of Stalin towards the Muslim Turkic population from the Crimea to Kazakhstan. Right? Policies of deportations, massacres, trying to destroy that culture. And we also see scientific racism and social Darwinism having a direct impact on policies here in the United States. Not only slavery and segregation, but something called eugenics. Right? Some of you might have heard of this. Eugenics was, again, a very specific race-based set of policies. Right? Many government policies. This is, United States government or institutions within the United States, educational institutions, carrying out policies to prevent so-called inferior people from reproducing, particularly African Americans, right? And then anyone declared mentally ill. And this included forced sterilizations, all kinds of medical experiments. Right? There's something called the Tuskegee syphilis experiments that were carried out on African Americans from 1932 to 1972. And if you do a little bit of research on who started the Tuskegee experiment, they were directly involved with eugenics, right? And that they would carry out these experiments, medical experiments, right, on these people without even letting the people know exactly what's happening to them or why. Right? So this idea of eugenics, right, these are government-sponsored programs and through certain universities. Right? But even the what I mentioned earlier about the Bidill, I mean, this is going on today. Right? Selling drugs to African American community based on very questionable science, medical science. Okay, anyway, we'll move into the more direct discussion now. Right? So anyway, the whole purpose here was to set up the broader ideological context for Orientalism, which is nothing more than a specific branch of Western attempts to undermine, devalue, and control the non-European world, and particularly the Islamic world. Right? So the first point we'll take a look at is the Orientalist objectives related to the Quran. I gave you the names of 3 of the most important early studies by Western scholars on the Quran. One by a man named Theodor Noldecker, a German scholar. His book was called The Geschichte des Korans, or History of the Quran, published in 1919. It's edited and revised by a man named F. Schwally. Another book by G. Bergstrasser and O. Pretzel, Die Geschichte des Koran-Texts, again in German, the history of the Quranic text. And then finally, a man named A. Jeffrey wrote a book, Materials for the History of the Text of the Quran, published in 1937. And there are many, many others that were, part of, during this time period and afterward. I'm only giving these 3 because they're the most commonly referred to early studies. And since they were the early studies, they also have this lasting impact. And all other Western studies on the Quran somehow deal with the ideas contained in these 3 early studies. Right? And I'm just going to list the general conclusions, right? The general conclusions that were drawn by from these studies. One is the influence and borrowing from Jewish and Christian scriptures. Right? So the Quran is not something unique. It's not historically unique, they're saying. Right? Certainly not a revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And all they're saying is that the Quran is some sort of compilation of things from Jewish and Christian scripture. Number 2, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was influenced by the Jahiliyyah poets. Right? So again, this claim that he was just a poet. We know these accusations from the Quran itself, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informs us that the pagan Arabs, the Quraysh, called Muhammad insane, a Majnoon, and that he was a poet, a Sha'ir or a Kahin, soothsayer. Right? Also, very importantly, a well-known accusation that Muhammad was an epileptic, and that his so-called revelations were nothing more than the product of his epileptic fits, right, and his wild dreams. Okay, they also said that Muhammad did engage in fasting, and that the fasting produced visions, right? And so he had these visions, and then he called the vision Gabriel or something like that. Right? So again, complete denial of any legitimacy whatsoever. Muhammad sallallahu as a prophet. Right? Number 5 was the collection of the Quran was a historical process with little concern for editing and style. Right? This is a very common accusation against the Quran, that it's a mishmash of information. It doesn't follow any order. There's no chronological order. There's no theological order, no thematic order, and that Muslims of the 2nd century, 3rd century just took a whole bunch of ideas, put them together, and threw this Quran out. Right? And then finally, that the Quran is a literary work no different from any other book. So it could just be analyzed and studied and discussed like any other book written by any other person or groups of people. Right? So the conclusions of the Western scholarship on the Quran is that it has nothing to do with revelation, it has nothing to do with any legitimacy to Islam as a religion, right? And it's just a byproduct of some historical aspects, right, of Muhammad being an epileptic and whatnot, and the fabrication of the Quran, in a sense, by Muslims of the 2nd and 3rd century. Right? Western views of the Quran today vary significantly. Right? There has been, some very important developments. Right? Many Western scholars are actually drawing closer to an understanding historically of when the Quran was written, right? Coming out of or compiled, very early on, early manuscripts that have been discovered, particularly manuscripts from Yemen that were discovered several decades ago, so that we do know that there's a growing amount of manuscript evidence that the Quran was written down, basically as we know it, from the 7th century. Right? And I gave you a website, IslamicAwareness.org. They have a wonderful presentation of the Quran manuscripts there. Right? So, in any case, there are still efforts today, right, to create narratives that undermine the Muslim accounts on both theology and history. Right? One example from the theological attacks against the Quran comes from a man named Kenneth Craig, who said that Muslims must rethink revelation. Now, by rethinking revelation, he means that Muslims must come to accept that Muhammad ﷺ was what he called the co-author of the Quran. Right? This is an attempt to conciliate Muslims. Right? He says, and this is Craig's opinion, that what Muslims have to accept is that Allah revealed information to Muhammad ﷺ, making the Quran a type of divine revelation, but that the actual words of the Quran are Muhammad's words. Right? So it's not saying it's a complete fabrication. And he's saying Muhammad received some kind of revelation from God. Right? But that the actual words that came out of Muhammad's mouth were his words. Right? So that the Quran, from his argument, would be a divine human production, part from God, part from Muhammad. The underlying rationale is that this would allow Muslims to be more flexible in interpretation. Right? So he says, since the wording is human, it can be altered. So if there's verses of the Quran that we don't like or don't fit into modern Western ideas of what is good or proper or moral or culturally correct or however you want to look at it, right? That we could just change the words of the Quran now because they were Muhammad's words, they weren't Allah's words. Right? And then Craig also says this way Muslims can participate in interfaith movement, right? Which sees all religions and scriptures as relatively equal. Because if Muslims saying we have unique revelation, we have the eternal word of Allah, then we're not going to participate in the kind of interfaith dialogue that he's calling for, which is basically saying no religion is true, no religion is real, everything is all relative. Anyway, the implications of this are, of course, devastating to the whole Islamic belief system that is predicated on the Quran being the eternal speech of Allah. Kenneth Craig's book is called The Mind of the Quran, Chapters in Reflection, and there's also a very, very good response by a Muslim scholar, Abdullah Saeed, in an article called Rethinking Revelation as a precondition for reinterpreting the Quran, a Quranic perspective, and this is from the Journal of Quranic Studies. And Saeed does a very, very good presentation to show that it's impossible for Muslims to ever accept what Craig is saying because everything in the Quran, every word, every verse of the Quran indicates that it is the word from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's nothing in the Quran to indicate in any way possible that anyone wrote the Quran. And of course, we understand this as Muslims, alhamdulillah.